Welcome to tutorial 1.7. The assignment is to explain how Simpson uses the concept of refusal and how it can make sense for indigenous people to refuse some of the goods offered by settler governments and cultures. You may make use of an example or two to help your account. I would break down the assignment into three parts. Explaining how Simpson uses the concept of refusal. And there I would note, don't explain how you would use the concept of refusal, just her, only her. So focus on her reading, her definition. If you need to quote her, you can, but just focus on her stuff. You may make use of an example of your own. I think that's a separate part. And how can it make sense for Indigenous people to refuse some of the goods offered by settler governments and cultures? I think that's a different part. So now you have three parts. I think it makes sense to define what Simpson says refusal is in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, I think it makes sense to illustrate. And in the third paragraph, I think it makes sense to explain why we should refuse, or Indigenous people should refuse. Defining what, Simpson has defined refusal as a political and ethical stance. That's a possible way that I'll go through in the tutorial. Illustrating what, an example, showing the example. I'll explain that in the tutorial also. Explaining why, according to Simpson, refusal could make sense for the following reasons. I will go through that also in the tutorial. Put together, here's what it looks like with the second paragraph being optional, as the assignment says. I think it makes sense to have a kind of thesis or theme for this assignment and for your answer, because that will tie it together. And I think the theme could be assertiveness and showing how refusal is assertive, whereas recognition is maybe a less assertive form, you could say, or at least Simpson says. So, first part, defining refusal. How would I do that? I would search the PDF and I would just search it with refus, because then you get refuse and refusal. That's what I've done to get some quotes for you. And I would say don't summarize the entire reading. Hopefully that's not a mistake that too many students make. But if you're summarizing the entire reading, it's not really answering the question. The question is about what is Simpson's way of defining refusal and why is it important. That's definitely different, I think, than summarizing the reading. Okay. Here are two main quotes, I think, on page 11 and page 12. Page 11, she's saying it's a political and ethical stance. Refusal comes with the requirement of having one's political sovereignty acknowledged and upheld, and raises a question of legitimacy for those who are usually in a power in the position of recognizing. Those of us writing about these issues can also refuse. So scholars or people writing about it in other ways can refuse. How can they refuse? Well, there's different ways. They can look at history. This is on page 12. She says they can look at history. They can have more robust forms of inquiry. They can change the way they study and write about Indigenous politics. Also on page 12, she says there could be calculated refusal of gifts to the state. So these are all ways of defining refusal in a positive way. There's also a negative way to define refusal. Defining refusal by negation. What is refusal not like? She says that refusal is not like recognition. Recognition is land acknowledgements. Here's one from the Queen's University page. You may have seen things like this where they're acknowledging the land that they're on, things like this. Maybe in a speech or in an email, you'll see these. It's a more modern thing, and it comes from this movement toward recognition. But Simpson is saying that unlike recognition, refusal is more assertive. She says it stands in stark contrast to the desire to have one's distinctiveness and culture recognized. So there's a stark contrast between recognition and refusal. When you're explaining how Simpson uses the concept of refusal, then, when in the first paragraph, I suggest you could say, in a negative sense, you could define, how does Simpson define it in this negative sense? So Simpson has defined refusal as a concept that is distinct from recognition. Recognition includes land acknowledgements. Refusal is, we might say, more assertive. That's the theme. You don't have to bold and turn it in red if you're writing your assignment, but I'm just emphasizing that this is kind of like, I think, a good thematic point to emphasize in your answer, and then your answer will tie together. All right. Refusal is, we might say more assertive and is moving more actively than recognition toward a more positive compromise or solution. A political and ethical stance. What about a positive definition of refusal? She did not do this, defining things as political refusal exactly, ethical refusal exactly. She didn't show you which one was which. I'm just surmising what she's kind of indicating. So the political refusal points seem to be refusing to let go of your group's sovereignty. That's political. Refusing to comply until there's acknowledgement and upholding of one's political sovereignty. That's a political. Refuse to recognize the illegitimate authority of the colonial state. That's, I think, political. And then more ethical forms of refusal, I would say refusing gifts from those claiming authority, refuse to acknowledge them as gifts, not even define them as gifts. It's not a gift. It's to say that you're a citizen of an illegitimate state. Change the way we study and write about Indigenous politics, looking at history. I think those maybe you could say belong to the ethical criteria as opposed to the political criteria of refusal. Explaining how Simpson uses the concept of refusal positively, then for potentially paragraph 1, you could say Simpson has defined refusal positively as a political and ethical stance. Here's the political stance, here's the ethical stance. You could have a paragraph on that. Put together with this, you could have a different outline. Here's a potential outline where you're defining refusal negatively, then defining refusal positively, then you're explaining why at the end. You've cut out the example. And so how does Simpson use the concept of refusal? Through negation. To define by negation means explaining what something is by showing what it is not. So in the first paragraph, you could show how Simpson does this. Refusal is, we might say, more assertive than recognition. It involves more actively than recognition, moving more actively than recognition toward a more positive compromise or solution. Affirmatively, how does she define the concept of refusal? Simpson has defined refusal positively as a political and ethical stance, the political stance, the ethical stance. And then finally explaining why it makes sense to refuse. Going through the example, points about the example, if you wanted to include an example. The first and main example is the Mohawks of Caughnawaga. They're nationals of pre-contact Indigenous polity. Enzi simply refused to stop being themselves. She goes through this example, tells you some things about it. This was on page 2. On page 7, she discusses it again, goes through some things and what they do. They refuse gifts of American and Canadian citizenship. Okay, the second example, what's a possible second example or a different example is the Iroquois national lacrosse team who bowed out of this tournament because the United Kingdom refused to recognize their passport and wanted them to use a Canadian or an American passport. That's the other example that she provides. You could talk about that. So if you want to use an example, the main example or refusal offered by Simpson is the Mohawks of Caughnawaga. This group of Mohawks have refused something, something. Another example is the Iroquois national lacrosse team. You could have both the examples here. This group refused something. These refusals are more assertive than claims about recognition. That's where you could tie in the theme or kind of thesis if you want to use the example and tie in the theme. What about the last part? What about explaining why? Why should they refuse? Because positive changes are possible. That's one answer. Because sovereignty may exist within sovereignty. One does not entirely negate the other. You could have a sovereign nation within a sovereign nation. So the sovereign nation state of Canada is the umbrella sovereignty, and then you could have a sovereignty within the sovereignty of the Iroquois. We could find better compromises for these sovereignties. There she's discussing on page 11 and 12. Scholarship could become more sensitive. Discusses that. Change the way we study and write about Indigenous politics. That's something that we could change. through refusal. The negative situations that could change. The reason to refuse, because to change the negative situations. There's a health crisis. Here's a headline about that health crisis, First Nations health crisis in Canada. Diabetes is a problem. Losing native languages is a problem. Colonial is ongoing and is an ongoing failure. She discusses all of those things. These are all reasons to explain why Indigenous groups should refuse. For the third paragraph, then, explaining why, according to Simpson, refusal could make sense for Indigenous people to follow because refusal assertively advocates. Again, you don't have to red and bold it, but I just want to show you this theme that you could follow where it ties everything together. Refusal could make sense because refusal assertively advocates some kind of positive change, something like this. Current situation for First Nations, not good. For example, positive changes could include, offer some examples of that. Putting it all together, then you could have a long version where you put everything in there. You could cut out some stuff. You can rearrange it however you want to do it. You have a positive definition. You have this negative definition. You have two examples, and you have a theme that ties it all together. Last paragraph, you have why refusal makes sense with some examples there. That's everything I have for you today. Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you for your time.